going on, video world? This is Charles. It's Willis Racing. Had a gentleman send me a message about setting up a rod bearing. Apparently he's got a rod bearing that's bad. Now, I don't know what the issue is with that rod bearing. I don't know whether he spun the bearing. I don't know. But anyway, you're definitely going to need a service manual to set that rod bearing up. So I'm just going to go through a procedure and show him, because I done a crank yesterday, and within doing that crank I took it off. It had a little stiffness in the rod bearing. Long story short, I decided to just take that rod off, and it was a good thing I took it off. The bearing had a little bit of strange wear on it. It wasn't bad, but it was just a little strange wear on it. So needless to say, I'm going to show him how to set this rod bearing up. But basically you have to have a service manual to set this rod bearing up. So I'm going to do the best I can to show him how. So anyway, here you go. Let me get around here in this video. As you can see, I already got my crank set up. And let me get this here over to, this is why you need the service manual to do a lot of this work. Let me get this video camera over here to my table so you can see the actual service manual. In fact, let me just raise this on up in the air. Get this up in the air. Now yesterday I set this crank in this motor. Was getting everything done, and I didn't like the way the rod bearing played out a little bit. So all of this I've already done. So let me zoom this in on this service manual. See if I can get most of this service manual in here where we can see some of the numbers. And let me get it out. For rod bearing, I've already done all of this actually, because I'm just making the video as an after. You're going to need the tooling to do all your clearance measurements. So to check the entire rod out. So I'm going to start up at the top of this service manual. I'm going to zoom in right here. Okay. Go ahead and check all your clearances. Check all your specs on that rod first. And let me get the rod. Try to do this because the football game's coming on. So I want to watch football. This is the rod. You want to measure everything. You want to measure everything in the top of your rod and go by your manual. So I've already done all this. I've done measured. I know that my small end clearance, it's all good. This is the basic, the whole rod, and get that in there. And I measured what's called the big end clearance. All of that was good. As you can see, I've already put new bearings in that rod. I've done everything I need to do. Really, this is okay. I'm gonna clean this up and put it in this. Go ahead and put it on the crank. I've already really done all of this. This is good, but this is for whoever that was that needed a rod situation. So you have to measure all this stuff. You have to measure your small end, measure your big end. Make sure it's all in spec before you do anything with this rod. So make sure that your rod is actually in spec and is usable. So I've done that. This rod's in spec. It is usable. All right. Then you go into your manual. All right. Now, this is why you need a service manual. Some people, I think, are trying to get around this stuff without having a service manual. It's not going to happen. If you look at your large end of that rod, okay, the large end of that rod, I'm going to zoom in on it. On that rod, if you look closely, you'll see there's a number on this rod. Let me get it to seat down here and get it together. Get it fully together here. Okay. See that number on the rod? And if you can't see it that good, this rod is 2F. All right. So with that 2 being on that rod for the big end, if you look in your service manual, I'm going to get down here and I'm going to show you now in the service manual, that 2 on that rod. Let's get down here on the service manual now. See that 2 on that rod? The 2, there it is right there, that's on that rod. It's normally 2 in a letter. This one here is really, if you can't see it, it's really 2, there it is, 2F. That 2 corresponds with this number 2 right here. Well, if you look across, that's the specifications on that rod. That rod is not within that specification right there. If you measure it, it's not in that spec. This rod's no good. Might as well toss it away and buy you another rod. That's why you need the service manual to do that. So I checked. This rod here was okay. It's still within specs. It's okay. All right. Now we're going to move on down to the next one. That's why you need the service manual. See right there where it says crank pin OD, crank pin code. We call these, I call them the journals that is on the crank. So it says crank pin, and which is really is outside diameter, OD. When you measure it out, it's going to be one, it's either going to be a 1, a 2, or a 3. All right. So if it's number 2, and actually, I'll just show you on the crank. So just think of it. This is your crank pin OD. So I checked my rod. My rod OD was okay. So now I'm going to check the crank. Make sure the crank is still. Make sure that the journal on the crank is still in service. That it's good enough. And the way you do that, I'm going to turn around to the crank now. Let me get around to the crank. I'm going to put this camera on the crank. All right, there's the crank. If you look right here, number 1 is for this rod. Number 2, this rod. Number 2, this rod. Number 2 is my 4th rod. And that's the rod that I have in my hand. That's on my 4th rod. That's the rod that I got that's in my hand. So, seeing that it is a number 2 that's on that crank, stamped on that crank, that this rod, the rod itself is stamped right here on this crank, and you can see it. It's number 2. Well, that number 2 correlates to the number 2 that's on that book. Okay, so now you see it right there. That correlates to this number 2 right here, or correction, right here. That correlates to that number 2 right there. That's the measurement. That's the measurement. that journal has to be at to show that it's good on that crank. That's where you need to be. All right. So if you check that, find out that your rod's good, you check, you find out that your crank is good, everything looks good, everything's, as far as the specs, it says it's all good and it's all serviceable. Now, only thing you have to simply do is say, okay, you've done checked your rod, you've done checked your crank, so they're both good. They're both in spec. So that means your bearings done wore out and the bearings wore out. But that means your parts are good. It means your rod's good. It means your crank good. You just lost a bearing. Your bearing just went bad. So on the same thing in your manual, you move up just a little bit right there. And you see that? If my rod is good, and you remember, that rod said what? That rod is showing me, see a number 2? 2F. That 2, that number 2 on that rod is the number 2 right here. That's what it relates to, is that 2. So, you remember the number that was on my crank for this rod? It was also a 2. The number on the crank that this rod, that journal, remember, that journal on the crank is a number 2. So now I have a 2 on my rod, I have a 2 on my rod, and that crank. Spin back around here to that crank. Get it there. That crank. These are for your rods. These numbers, left to right. L, first one is a rod. First rod is a 1 on that journal. A 2 on the next one. A 2 on the next. And a 2. That 2 relates to my last journal over there. So that's a 2. So I have a 2 for my rod and a 2 on the crank journal. If I go into my book right here, it's why you need a service manual. See where it says bearing selection table. Bearing selection table. Remember, I got a 2 on my rod. I got a 2 on my crank journal. If I take a 2, come to the crossroads of a 2, that tells me I need a brown bearing. That's my bearing right there. So for this rod on there, I need a brown bearing. And now once you got that bearing, you do it as simple as you do anything else. I've already done put the bearing on. I've already done seen it. I've already done measured it. And boom, I'm ready to go. After I measure everything like that, remember me saying, I'll always go and I'll go ahead and take plastic gauge. Again, put me a piece of plastic gauge on that, and simply I'll show how to do that. I can turn around here to this bearing, and let me get to that journal. That journal should be, let me turn to that journal, and you're going to see on that journal, see on that bearing journal, and it's glowing like hot sun. That piece of green, or that piece of glowing there, that is actually where I had plastic gauge. And Went by my measurement in the books where this should be in service. So there's my plastic gauge. See if I can get it to. But I went by the measurement in the book for what it considered to be in service. And you see where I had my plastic gauge up on that? Right there. And boom, I just measured that bad baby out. And boom, got what I want. So I know that it's in spec. I know that these bearings are good. And you can see actually where I had put it. So see it right there also on the bearing when I put it on and squashed it down. So that's as simply as putting that bearing on there. And I'll kind of do it right now for a reference. So take this in account. I had taken a green piece of plastic gauge. That's what that green is on there. I put that little piece of plastic gauge right there. Turn my bearing like this here. And I got lines. I made this here. I made this little stand just for this where I could lock this down. But this crank rod went in here. The rod went in there like this here on this particular. There you go. Sit down in there. And that's how that went in. And you got to realize I made this up just for doing this. And then I had that plastic gauge in there. That's what made that little mark. So with that plastic gauge in there, me placing the caps with the bearings in it. Now take my screws, my rod bolts, and you tighten them down. That will squeeze that rod together. When that squeezes that rod together, that presses down on the bearing and that squishes that plastic gauge, and that gives me that measurement. And I take that measurement, I measure it through the book. When that is squoze down and it squeezes that plastic gauge, you take it and you do the measurement. And this is the specifications that you need that are in the book. That big end, the Conrad oil clearance, your rod clearance. Let me get it right here on the book. Move my light out of the way. All right. This is why you need the service manual. See that Conrad big head, the big end. Ooh, I was getting ready to say something else there. The big end oil clearance that you need is 0.032 to 0.056 millimeter, 0.0013 to 0.0022 in inches. And if you look at your plastic gauge will show you. See if I can get it. Zoom in there. Will it? Well, once you see a piece of plastic gauge, you'll be able to understand it. It'll have the inches here, and it'll be within specs. You check on those inches, and by looking at how the spread out, how that squish pattern is. So you remember on my rod and on that journal, there was a squish pattern. You measure that pattern up to what you want. If I was doing a nitrous motor, I make it a little bit loose so I can get play, just a little loose. On a stock motor like this motor, I made it a little bit tight. I tightened her up. That's just the way I do it. You know, you can do whichever way you want. You can do special, whatever. But like this motor here is just going to be a stock motor, so I tightened her up. I tightened it up just a little bit. It'll give the motor a little bit more overall, a little bit of higher oil pressure. But Tighten them up just a little bit. Anyway, that's how you do that. And that's why you need a manual. So definitely get a manual and go to work. It's as simple as that. Anyway, I say in all my videos, bye-bye.